Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In the preceding section we did a little bit of manual resource levelling in order to try to overcome overallocations of the bride and groom's time in our wedding plan. Now what we're going to do in this section is to look at automating the levelling of resources in Project 2019. And primarily we're going to look at the options that are available when you're doing this. Now before we start, I should point out that when we did the levelling before, we came up with a schedule that indicated a potential wedding date of August the 20th. Now that's a good starting point. I think we may go for a date a little bit later than that. But first of all, we need to make sure that all of our issues are overcome. It may well be that it appears to be a good date and the plan appears to work, but until you've actually looked at any outstanding issues, you can't really be certain that the end date, in this case the wedding date, is going to be achievable. The other thing to bear in mind is that with any project you are dependent on making sure, for example, that you have all of the tasks, dependencies, etc. in place, that your estimates, your time estimates, your resource estimates are good, and that your resources are going to be available. Now we're going to take a look at some of the things that might go wrong a little bit later on in the course, but for the moment let's assume that our resources are available and we're pretty much scheduling this project on the basis that given that a lot of it is down to the bride and groom, they're going to be very committed to getting the wedding running to schedule. And that therefore they'll be more than happy to put in a bit of extra effort to deal with any problems that arise. Now the first thing I'm going to do is undo the levelling that we did in the previous section. So if I go to the Resource tab, in the Level group there is an option called Clear Levelling. Now look carefully at the schedule, particularly around the area of Select and Order Wedding Dress. So now we're back to where we were. Now what we're going to try and do is to level automatically. And before we do that, let's look at the levelling options. Now the resource levelling dialog has many options and we're going to look at a few of them in this section. One or two we're going to save until later on in the course. Now first of all, do you want levelling calculations to be automatic or manual? Now I normally set this at manual because whilst having Project 2019 automatically deal with levelling can work quite well, when you're setting up a project, it can actually be a little bit annoying because you get to a situation where it's levelling resources and you're thinking to yourself, well, hang on a minute, I've got loads more tasks and resources to put in yet. So you're doing work that is really a waste of time because until all of the project or the bulk of the project is in there, there's not really any point in doing this. So I tend to go for manual levelling calculations. The next option, look for over allocations on a default day-by-day basis. You can also have minute by minute, hour by hour, down to month by month. Now this is a very important option and I'm going to explain it to you with an example. Let's suppose you have somebody doing a task for 2 hours a day over the course of a week. And maybe it's the only job they've got to do on a project. But on a Wednesday, you need them to do a full day task. So they've got an 8-hour job to do on Wednesday. If you have over allocations being looked for on a day-to-day basis, Project 2019 will look at Wednesday and say they're over allocated because they've got 2 hours on the first task and 8 hours on the second task. That's 10 hours. That's too much work. But if instead I said on a week-by-week basis, what Project 2019 will do is to say, let's add up that first task, a week, 5 days, 2 hours, that's 10 hours. Let's add the time for the second task, that's 8 hours. But if instead I said on a week-by-week basis, what Project 2019 will do is to say, okay, let's add up that first task, a week, 5 days, 2 hours, that's 10 hours. Let's add the time for the second task, and that's 8 hours. So that's a total of 18 hours. And I've got plenty of time in a week to do 18 hours of work. So as far as Project 2019 is concerned, in that case, they're not over allocated. Basically what Project 2019 is doing is levelling out or evening out the work. Now, in case of the wedding, well, we're not really that concerned about exactly what hours are being worked. The bride and groom have indicated the proportion of the time they need on each task, so I'm going to be quite happy with week by week leveling. The next option is the leveling range. Do I want to level the entire project, or do I want to just level a certain date range? What can sometimes happen when you're working on a long project is you may, for example, have the project in phases. And over the next phase, say the next few months, it may be important that you have the resources leveled. But for phases of a project which are much further off into the future, leveling resources might be a bit of a waste of time because you don't really have the detail in yet. So leveling resources over that period really is a waste of time and will flag problems that don't really yet exist. So in that situation, you might want to choose to say just the next few months to level. On this occasion though, we're going to leave it at level entire project. The next option we're going to look at is the leveling order. But in fact, I'm going to cover that last. I want to look at the checkboxes below that first because I'm going to briefly review those. First of all, there's an option, level only within available slack. Now we're going to talk about slack and the critical path later on in the course, but basically, if I check that box that says level only within available slack, that means that leveling will be done in such a way that the end date of the project is not delayed. Now this may well constrain how successful leveling can be, but it does mean that we can be certain that this isn't going to cause a delay in the project. At the moment, this is unchecked, so any leveling we do may well delay the end of the project. The second option, leveling can adjust individual assignments on a task. Rather than move a task, and of course the assignments associated with it for all of the resources that are assigned to the task, it can adjust individual assignments. So it could take one resource and adjust that resource's assignment on a task in order to overcome an over-allocation issue. That's currently checked, so we're going to allow that. And the third option there, leveling can create splits in remaining work. You may recall that when I did that manual leveling exercise and it moved some of the tasks associated with a tire out to the right, you may have noticed that one of the tasks was actually split into two with a sort of dash line between the two halves. What Project can do is to split outstanding tasks and say we're going to do part of the job. Then we're going to take a break from it. Then we're going to do the other part of the job. And this is on the basis that in that gap in the middle, the resources working on the task are needed to do something else. Again, we've got this ticked, so it's allowed. The fourth option, level resources with the proposed booking type, is one we're not really going to cover on this course. You can really have two types of booking. You can have a proposed booking and a confirmed booking. Now, as I say, the use of these booking types is outside the scope of what we're covering on this course. But later on in your use of Project 2019, when you start looking at proposed and confirmed booking types, that's an important option to be aware of when you're leveling. The fifth option dictates whether leveling can be applied to manually scheduled tasks. Now, generally speaking, by default, we don't level manually scheduled tasks. But if you do want to include manually scheduled tasks, then check that box. So that's the group of 5 options. 1 or 2 of them will come up again later on in the course. And let's concentrate now on the leveling order. In Project 2019, there are 3 options for leveling order. And by default, the leveling order here is standard. And with standard, what basically happens is Project 2019 uses all of the information you've given it about resources, tasks, dependencies, constraints, etc., and does the best job that it can to level all of the resources on the project. But you do have 2 other options. Now, these 2 options are very different, but as I'm sure you appreciate by now, even using the same terminology and looking at the same types of problem on 2 different projects, you very often take a very different approach to solving a problem. Now, the first other option we have is called ID only. And the way that ID only leveling works is that leveling is done strictly in terms of the ID numbers. They're the numbers on the left that you can see in the table in the Gantt chart. So task 1, task 2, task 3, and so on. The higher the number, the more likely it is to be leveled. I mentioned very early on in the course that there is absolutely no reason for you to put the tasks here in, if you like, chronological order or any other order for that matter. But many people do put tasks in an order, whereby if leveling is to occur, then the ones that are, if you like, further down the schedule, the ones with the higher ID numbers, will tend to be leveled to be delayed the most. Now that usually corresponds with the general concept that the tasks near the beginning of the schedule are the ones that are done first, and the ones nearer the end are the ones that are done last. So with ID only, that's the rule that Project 2019 follows. The other option is priority and then standard. And what happens with this is that you give projects some guidelines on the basis of priority. So let's suppose that we have a particular task that we definitely don't want to be delayed. We know it's involved in an over-allocation issue, but we don't want it to be delayed. What we would do is to give that task a higher priority than all of the other tasks. Similarly, if we have a particular task wherever it was in the schedule, it wouldn't matter whether it was near the beginning or the end. Wherever it was, we would give that task a lower priority, and that would tend to reduce its chance of being delayed as part of the leveling process. So first of all, what I'm going to do is to try just to use standard leveling and see what sort of results we get. So I select standard and I click on level all, and Project 2019 comes up with a new schedule. Now you're going to see some problems with the schedule straight away. The number of red over allocation indicators is greatly reduced, so that's good. You won't necessarily always see them all disappear, but there is certainly a lot less than there were before we did the leveling. But let's look at our end date. If I scroll down and take a look at the end date, well, our end date is now December the 9th, 2019. So currently the way the schedule is planned with all the tasks that we have in, we're not going to be finished until December the 9th, 2019. But let's have a look at some of the issues, because there are some issues in here. For instance, if we scroll up to catering and make caterer shortlist, you can see that there's a huge gap between make caterer shortlist and then book caterer and finalize menu. So there's clearly some work needed there on the scheduling, because we don't want that huge long gap. But perhaps even more importantly, if we scroll up and take a look at the order of the dress, we can see that the ordering of the dress and the measurements and fittings and the attire generally is being left right until the very last minute. If you look at those dates up there, if you imagine that the wedding is in the middle of December, we're not doing any of these things related to attire until right up to that date. So obviously we're going to need to do something about that, because that's way too late in the day to be making decisions about the attire. So standard leveling hasn't really done the job for us on this occasion. So let's undo that, and let's try setting 1 or 2 priorities. Now, one of the things that takes a little bit of getting used to when you're doing leveling is that there are quite a few options, and although I'm going to demonstrate priorities now, you may alternatively choose to add things like constraints that they must start on a certain date, or even make them manually scheduled tasks. But let's suppose the first thing that I'm going to try is to say, well, the most important thing to get started with is to sort out the guest list and the invitations. And of course, as part of that, we're going to need to book the venue so that we can send out the invitations. And we're going to need to have decided on the actual date and so on. Most of that is covered by the dependencies that we've already set up. If I just make that a little bit wider. But let's go into Make Guest List and change its priority. So on the General tab, we have a priority set to 500. So let's change that to 600. And click OK. So we're making that the highest priority task. And then we're going to do the same for sending out invitations. Let's make that 600 as well. And then let's go into leveling options and choose priority standard and click level all, and let's see what happens. So now if we scroll down to wedding day, so we can see that date is now slightly earlier. It's December the 6th, 2019. So we've actually come up with a slightly better solution. So having sorted out that particular issue, we might turn our attention now to the attire and give that a higher priority than it currently has. And maybe also look at some of the other tasks, perhaps ones which could do with a lower priority, so things like the florist. We may decide that the florist is one of the last things we would need to do. But in that way, with selective use of priorities, we should be able to come up with a pretty good schedule. So what I want you to do next is to give you a chance to try a little bit of resource leveling and scheduling now on the bathroom refit project. So we're going to do that in exercise 4, and that's going to be covered in the next section. So I'll see you then.